What's really interesting that I have found is people rarely quit a company. They usually quit the person they're reporting to. So as you're thinking about, people that quit, how does that play in your mind? Hi, welcome to another episode of Baktari MD. As you know, this season we're going to talk about Crash CEO School. So the goal of this is to kind of go over things that when I was starting and wherever you are in your journey, to learn the lessons so you don't have to learn it the painful way of experiencing it. So today I want to talk about a quality that is going to be necessary, especially in your senior staff, or if it's a small company, almost everybody in your company. And, there are different names for it, but the name I give to it is ownership. And the way I describe that is for companies to be super successful. Let's say you have a startup with only 3, 4, or 5 people. Clearly, in that kind of situation, if you have three out of the 5 clocking in and out, treating it like just a job, the likelihood that you're going to be successful is going to be reduced, especially when you're starting out, and even in bigger organizations where there's a handful of leaders that are steering the train. Getting sort of the ownership mentality among that group is going to be very, very important. And it can actually determine whether your company succeeds or not. I'm sure every day there's, for example, in Silicon Valley, lots of startups with lots of great ideas begin. However, lots of startups with great ideas probably fail too. Some of that can be cash flow, but a lot of it has to do with the quality and the commitment of the buy-in of the original group. And I think a case can be made that the more buy-in the original group has, more likely the company to be successful, assuming that it's a great idea and the fundraising goes well. But I'm sure there are lots of companies that the funding went well and it was a great idea, but there wasn't the commitment and sense of ownership. So I want to talk about that because as CEO, your job is going to be not only looking for identifying, but really mentoring people into this concept of ownership. On my last video, which I will link above, we talk about some of that in terms of the things you need to do to make your company successful. And one of those is mentoring people. And we had the video on the mentoring, but I want to talk about specifically how you can mentor for ownership. And also in terms of selecting out people who are more likely to be that. Before we go any further, I want to talk about the definition of ownership. Now, you can give this different names. In our organization, we call them owners versus renters. But whatever the name is, it's a mindset. It's a mindset that people who belong to certain organizations have, in the sense that they're giving the same product every day that they would as though they owned the company. Now, we see this all in our lives. For example, if you buy a new car, you're going to maybe go the first week or two, park it in if you go to Walmart, you're going to park it in the corner of Walmart where no one can ding it. You may wax it every day. You may check for dings and scratches every time you park it. You may not give it to the valet guy. I think when you bought the car, nobody gave you a manual and said, now that you're an owner, these are the kind of things you need to do. It becomes intuitive. And this is the funny part. When someone becomes an owner, no one gives them a manual on how to be an owner. More examples of this, like, for example, if you rent a car, right? If you just go to Hertz or Avis and rent a car for the week, how are you going to treat that car versus you just went to the showroom and you got a brand spanking new Honda Accord? How are you going to behave? You didn't get an owner's manual in terms of treating the brand new Honda you bought, a certain way. You intuitively know how to become an owner versus if you rented a car. So on one hand, asking people to be owners may seem like you almost have to teach them, but I actually think it's more of a button that goes off and they say, I really own this company. And I think that's really where it's at. Imagine, again, more analogies. Like if you are renting a house, you may rent a house and walk through the front door, and there may be a certain plant right next to the front door that's struggling. When you're renting the house, you're not going to maybe notice it. But the minute you buy the house and you are walking by that plant, you're obviously going to notice it. You're going to notice scratches on the wall, dings here and there, because you own it. Again, you didn't need a manual. You didn't need an in-service. You didn't have to take a YouTube course or watch a YouTube video on how to be an owner of a house or an owner of a car. But unfortunately, when it comes to jobs, that is a transition for some people. And we're going to talk about why that's a transition for some people, why it's not intuitive for some people, and what you can do when you need that specific quality and the job really calls for it, how to mentor for it, if that makes sense. By the way, if you really like content like this, make sure you comment, like, and subscribe. It really helps us create more content like this. Thank you. Okay, so now that we've brought up this concept of ownership, the one thing you have to really, the big elephant in the room is 99% of jobs out there don't really require that. Because, if someone gives you a job and you get a job at Macy's, or you have a job, if you have a job at as a teller or anywhere, 95%, 99% of jobs, they don't want you to change their world, right? So if you get a job at a department store, they obviously want you to come in, clock out, do a great job, be nice, sell some stuff, but they're not asking you to change Macy's stock price, right? They're not, or if you get a job at Bank of America necessarily. They want you to do a good job, but if you're the 100,000th employee, they're not looking for you to change their stock price or revolutionize how they do business. But in a smaller organization, a startup and a small to medium-sized organization, one person theoretically can take a company quantum leaps ahead. And this is why ownership in a smaller to medium-sized company, and sometimes even in larger companies, but in the right position, meaning leadership, can have dramatic effects. So if you can get that sense of ownership in a small organization or a medium or larger organization for the leadership, your chances of taking quantum leaps ahead improves dramatically. If you don't get that obviously is going to lower your chances, or you're not going to have as good of an outcome as you've had. I just do want to clarify one thing. When I say sense of ownership, I don't mean working more than 40 hours a week. Okay, the question is, someone's got to be there for 40 hours a week. Are they going to treat it like they own the company? Is there an opportunity for them to treat it like it's their own company? And we're going to talk about that. So this is the whole idea of getting owners, sort of not renters. And if you're in a position where you're the CEO and you're in charge of a small company or even a medium-sized company, you're going to want some of these qualities from your senior leadership. Before you decide someone you're bringing on board or approaching someone who's already in your organization about having more of an owner's mentality, there are a couple of things you need to kind of ask yourself, either when you're interviewing them or when you are going to approach them. You have to understand, where are they in their lives? I know there have been certain times in my life where I just wanted a job. I'm just going to do a great job. I'm going to clock in. I'm going to clock out. But I just needed a job. And it didn't mean I was going to do a fantastic job. It just meant that this wasn't going to be, the place I was going to retire, or the place that meant the whole world to me. If the company did well, it did well. If it didn't do well, whatever. Well, I'm going to do a good job, but that's it. And there have been stages in my life. So a lot of times when you're approaching someone or interviewing, this becomes a little difficult, but you have to figure out, where are they in their lives? And, what does this job mean to them? I know I've taken jobs where I knew this is simply a stepping stone until I got the job I really wanted, or the career I really wanted. And it's hard to go to someone who it's the wrong time in their lives. For example, they're going through a lot of personal stuff, or job is not really where they eventually want to be, or even the organization they want to be in, and then say, hey, I'd like you to become an owner. So before you ask people to become owners, you have to understand those kinds of things. Are they qualified, or meaning are they at a stage in their lives where ownership actually is even possible? Because obviously, if it's not, you're going to be banging your head against the wall. So before you approach them or you hire them or you promote them, you have to understand, are they? This may be tricky because very few people during the interview process say, you know what, you caught me. Let me tell you the truth. I'm not really in it to win it. I mean, look, I just need a paycheck right now. But you caught me, this ownership thing, forget that. I mean, no one's going to say that in an interview. So you can't really go up to someone during an interview and say, hey, do you want to be an owner? Is this job going to mean the whole world to you? And can you see yourself being here for a long time? Obviously, you know what kind of answers you're going to get during an interview. So, how you get past that and figure that out is challenging. But again, that's going to be the goal, to figure out if you've caught them at the right time. And then I want to talk about, assuming, you identify and you catch these people, you have to then say, you know what, does this job even call out for it, right? For example, if you're going to hire your 99th accountant in a big accounting firm, I'm not sure you really want that 99th accountant to revolutionize your accounting company, right? Because at a certain point, if you're hiring the 1,000th nurse at a hospital or the 1,000th person at a certain thing, most of us realize that job is not really, we want a great job, we want great quality, but we are not going to ask that person to revolutionize our whole company. So before you go and ask for sort of ownership, and that doesn't mean those people can't really love it and be committed, but we're talking about asking them to give that product, and the job may not call for it, right? I mean, if you just have an assembly line job where literally they just have to do something on a factory line, of course you want a great job, but you're not asking them to change your stock price or, quadruple your revenues if they're just working on an assembly line, metaphorically. So you have to first look at it and say, this job that I'm thinking about asking someone to be an owner, does it even call for it, right? Now, remember, I'm going to argue that 95% of jobs in the United States don't call for it, right? Because they are just a job where a good job will be adequate. But if you're in the group of 5 people that are starting up a company, or in the 5 leadership of a small to mid-size, that will call for it because it's going to improve your chances for success. I think the other thing that people think about when they're being asked to be an owner, they're going to think, even if I were to become an owner, will this be noticed, right? Because again, if you're the 99th accountant in a big firm and you give the extra juice and the extra commitment, it's possible it won't even be noticed. So are you in a situation where if you give that ownership, will it even be noticed, and will it be appreciated, right? Because at the end of the day, a lot of times when companies are hiring you, if it's a filler position, even if you gave that something extra, it'd be nice, but I don't think it would really matter, and you don't want to get burned where you kind of give that and it means nothing. So obviously the person has to size up, is this the right situation for me to give everything I have, not necessarily work more than 40 hours a week, but give it that sense of I own this place, right? And which ties into my next thing is there a culture of ownership in that organization? It's very difficult to ask someone to become an owner in an organization where the other senior leadership are not owners. And we talked about this in the last episode, right? The majority of people are not dialed in and are just renting, clocking in and out, and you bring someone who's an owner, they're culturally going to feel like an outsider, and there's going to be a tremendous amount of pressure for them to conform, right? So you have to be careful, if you're going to ask someone to be an owner and then put him in an organization where nobody else is, that's probably not going to work, and they're going to pick up on it. You'd have to almost sit down with them and say, listen, we're trying to change the culture, and you're going to be our first one. But it's going to be quite the uphill battle if everyone in the organization is like that. And kind of, you would imagine that kind of scenario happening when someone's brought into an organization and they want to change it one person at a time. But it's going to be difficult, and it's doable, but it's going to be difficult to get the buy-in from the person you bringing in as an owner when the majority of people are not that way. And then after you do that, you also have to, discuss with the person, is there truly an upside for ownership? And this is really tricky because I've met a lot of people who've kind of have given that commitment just for whatever reason, and done it for 10 years, and it has gone unnoticed maybe, or after 10 years, basically, the company either folded and closed, or they got laid off. So I think there is a danger sometimes where people say, look, if I even give this, is anyone going to recognize it, and will I have an upside? And this is where your mentoring comes into place, right? Because you have to then say, look, this company does recognize it. We really do. We look for it, we validate it, we promote it, and then we compensate appropriately. So if a certain person is responsible for, increasing the revenues of your company or growing your base or your clients, they need to, maybe not the next day or the next week, but at some point, if they're responsible for part of the reason, why your company is growing, I think it's incumbent on you to compensate them, not only financially, but professionally, in terms of promotion, status, title, financial. But I think there has to be, at some point, a correlation between if they're taken care of and their sense of ownership. Because if you really think about it, that's what ownership really is, right? I mean, if you're the owner of a pizzeria and this year you sold 10,000 pizzas and next year you sold 30,000 pizzas, what's going to happen to your bottom line? I mean, assuming everything else is equal, it's going to improve. So owners get that positive feedback when they're successful. So my argument will be that staff that act like owners and cause the company to grow actually need that positive feedback just the same way as an owner. What's interesting is owners often don't get the feedback right away. You can imagine an owner who, let's go back to the pizzeria, sells 30,000 pizzas the next year, but decides to take all that money, reinvest it into better equipment, open up a new location. So again, this idea of ownership, is not sort of meant to be a direct one-to-one correlation, but over the long term, it has to correlate. In fact, I would be very weary and skeptical of people who come and say, look, I've been here for a year, our revenues have grown 20%, and you should talk to me about compensating me more. That's actually a red flag. What's interesting is the ones that are owners, it's kind of not what you would think, rarely are focused on their own compensation to that direct, correlation. The ones that have it really tied down are probably the ones that are sort of pretending to care and pretending to be owners, because the people who genuinely own a business understand unexplained expenses come up. We're going to reinvest the money, and they're in it for the long haul. Owners are in it for the long haul versus people who are not owners, who want this immediate feedback correlation between the effort they're putting in. And I try to mentor a lot of young people because I get this where, I've talked to people who say, you know what, I killed it for the company. So this year I'm going to go into my annual meeting and I'm going to really, draw a line in the sand that I need to be compensated. And I really argue against that necessarily, unless they're really in a company that long-term is not going to acknowledge it, which then raises another issue. But this sort of one-to-one correlation, because owners don't get one-to-one correlation, but here now the flip side is, but over the long term, there should be a definite correlation. By that long term, I don't mean like a decade or two, but clearly if you were to trend the compensation versus trending the overall growth of the company and profit and bottom line, there better be a correlation if they're giving that other product. The flip side, of course, of this is someone who does a great job, right, but doesn't really give you that sense of ownership. It's not even a tit for tat. I mean, when you look at someone in your organization and you say, well, they're doing a great job, but if I lost them tomorrow, no big deal. We'd just find someone else and the company would go on. So, obviously they're probably not giving you that something extra. There are other people, I'm sure, in your organization where you look at them and say, oh my gosh, if Bill or Susie or Fred leaves, we're going to need 5 people to replace each one of them. Not because they're working more than 40 hours, but within those 40 hours, they bring so much institutional knowledge, so much execution, so much commitment, so much, knowledge of the workings of your organization that sometimes, you lose someone and literally you're going to have to hire 3 people, 4 people to replace them, even though they only work 40 hours a week. How can that be? Because they're bringing so much value. And that value is often tied to the sense of ownership, right? So I think as you look around your organization and you say, oh, if we lose Bill, no big deal. I mean, yeah, it'd be a little painful. We'd have to train someone, but life goes on. But then, how you really spot the owners, okay, and these are the people you need to for sure take care of, are the ones you say, oh my gosh, if we lose Fred or Bill, we're toast. By the way, not necessarily because they're the only ones, and I want to separate this out. There's 2 people like that. There's people who are owners that if you lose them, you're toast. And there's other people who it's not because they're doing such a great job, but that there's no redundancy in their position, right? And I don't want you to mistake that for ownership, right? Because sometimes you only have, one person in that department, right? And yes, it would be like, if there's one guy who's literally managing a certain thing in your organization and nobody else has institutional knowledge of that place, yes, you don't want to lose that person. However, don't mistake that for ownership, right? The kind of ownership I'm talking about are people that literally, okay, it doesn't matter. There could be 5 other people in their department, but if you lose them, okay, you're going to be in a world of hurt. And the other thing that I find really interesting is that the people who have a sense of ownership intuitively they know that you will be toast without them, right? Right? Literally, things will come crashing. But they still come to work often as though you could fire them on the spot. They don't take advantage of the fact that they're so needed. And that's another sign that they have this ownership mentality. It's interesting that the people that I have seen that can hurt the company the most, okay, are the least likely to walk in every day and say, oh, I dare you to fire me. I'm going to show up to work late. I'm going to take a few extra days off. You can't fire me because you'll be toast without me. Rarely do you get that because the ones that really have a sense of ownership don't look at it that way. They're in it with you. And which really gets to my last point, which is, that there's this sense of loyalty and we're all in it together. That's part of this ownership mentality. Okay, so when you get the whole package, you won't be held hostage. The company will not be held hostage because that owner mentality is we're all in the same family. We all want the same outcome. I'm not going to sit there and, kind of say, I dare you to fire me. I'm going to start slacking off because only I know everything I know and you are really, really toast. The last thing I really want to cover, which is like a very interesting aspect of this ownership, a lot of times people come into an organization, especially one that's already dialed into ownership, and whatever you want to call it. In your company, you may want to call it something else. But sometimes you hire someone, you bring someone into the organization, and they're like, oh, holy moly, all this ownership stuff. I think the only way for me to survive in this organization is I got to start talking the lingo. I got to talk like an owner. We need to kill it, and I'm in it, and whatever the words are. What's interesting about that is sometimes I think people can figure out that that's what's needed to be successful in an organization, and sometimes it's not really genuine. Sometimes it's just like, okay, in this organization, I just need to pretend to care, right? This whole idea of ownership and caring goes synonymously. And so there are people who may try to pretend to care because they figured out that's what's in the culture. The problem with that really is eventually, people can't keep it up for long. Things slip, and it becomes obvious that it's not as genuine as you think. Luckily, that doesn't happen that often, and the majority of people who genuinely care and genuinely want the organization to move forward. The last thing I just want to leave you with is as someone who's going to be mentoring people to basically care and be an owner, you have to care about them. You have to take care of them. It has to be genuine. As I always say, to be head of an organization or head of a department, your job is really to take care of everyone that is working underneath you, that you're mentoring, that you're working with. Your job is to improve their lives, both in the workspace and sometimes outside the workspace, as the situation calls for. But, that is really your job. Can you get some additional software that will make their lives easier? Can you help them improve the quality of their workspace? Can you get, additional stuff that will make their day go easier? Can you add extra technology to take burdens off of them? It has to be you who is looking out for them, because at the end of the day, nobody wants to work for someone who's not looking out for them, right? I mean, it's a rare person that says, I'm going to give everything, but, the people I'm reporting to, don't really care. What's really interesting that I have found is people rarely quit a company. They usually quit the person they're reporting to. So as you're thinking about, people that quit, how does that play in your mind? So, if you really genuinely don't care, you can't genuinely ask them to care not only about you, but the company, right? So it's got to be a two-way street. And whether it's genuine, it's going to be both ways, not just one way. I don't know if that makes sense, but it has to be bilateral. It has to be something that both sides are giving. And when you see it, you'll recognize it. When you see someone you're reporting to who actually cares about you and cares about the company, you'll notice it. And when you have someone working for you, I know I said this was the last thing, but there's one more thing I want to say, which is a lot of times when I'm trying to describe ownership to someone who has not had a lot of jobs that required ownerships, and you're trying to tell them what it is you're looking for. Before we go to our next topic, I do want to thank our sponsor, eNational Testing, for sponsoring this episode of Baktari MD.
Why hasn't getting a simple laboratory test been as easy as ordering something online? Well, now it is. With 3 simple steps on eNationalTesting.com, you can have your laboratory test ordered, go in for testing the same day, and get your results quickly, right to your email. eNational Testing is fast, convenient, and confidential. Begin taking charge of your health today with eNational Testing's complete healthcare panels and easy-to-understand results at over 2,000 locations nationwide. No matter who you are, where you are in the United States, or what your health concerns are, eNational Testing is your comprehensive resource for laboratory testing services. It's time to focus on yourself. Let us do the hard work for you. eNational Testing. Easy, convenient, and tailored to your health needs.
The one thing I always say to them is, I say, one day you're going to be the boss, right? One day you're going to be in charge. And let me ask you a question. When you become the boss, okay, what kind of people do you want to surround yourself with, right? Think about it. What kind of people do you want to be around you, right? And invariably, you'll get it out of them. You're like, I want people around me that are going to, treat this job like they own it. I want them to care. So I always say, listen, if that, to figure out how you should be, why don't you be the kind of person you would want to promote and hire when you're the boss, right? When you're the boss, who do you want, right? Well, I want someone who cares. I want someone who's committed. I want someone who's all in. I don't want anyone that this is just a stepping stone. Okay, well, if that's what you would look for, just an idea, why not be that person? Right? Because if you tell me that's going to be important to you when you're the boss, well, maybe it should be important to you when you're not the boss. So when you become the boss, it will all make sense. So there you go. Okay, well, that was a lot on ownership. I hope that made sense. I hope this helps you. Please leave in the comments what your experience has been like with becoming an owner, asking people to become an owner. And again, by owner, I mean caring, right? That extra level of caring, like you own the place. And if you've had any trials or tribulations or if things have gone well. Okay, well, thank you so much. And we'll see you on the next episode of Baktari MD. Thank you.